Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video we'll talk about COVID-19, a controversial topic, but we will approach this topic from the perspective of psychology, or to be precise, from the perspective of psychoanalysis. On this channel we generally discuss topics revolving around Jungian psychoanalysis, so the perspectives of psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Carl Jung being a Swiss psychoanalyst that worked around the turn of the 20th century as a student of Freud, but later diverging from Freud's ideas in certain significant ways that we discuss in other videos. This video, however, is precisely focused on, let's say, the ego, the aspect of the ego as Jung understands it, however, supplemented with some of my own interpretations revolving around the ego, specifically understanding the ego as a narration, as sort of a story that we tell about ourselves and the implications of that. Now, what we're specifically interested in the context of COVID-19 is how such an event, a trauma, let's say, on a societal level affects the narrative body, which sort of is built upon assumptions that are also founded in the cultural context that we exist in. Now, this topic is related closely to headlines or let's say tags like ego death, so the ego sort of breaking down, being dismembered and having to be rebuilt again in the aftermath of this sort of trauma, of this rupture, and which is why we can apply these notions to the individual development, to the development of the subject, and the sort of encounter of what I refer to as negative judgment in the external world. Again, what we would experience as trauma. Before we get into that, I wanted to briefly give an introduction to the ego as narrative, because I think we need that as a fundament to understanding the effects of the ruptures of this narrative. Now, the ego for Jung and others is the center of the psyche. Jung says it's the subjective center of the psyche. There is an objective center of the psyche, which we'll get to later. We'll get to sort of a proposition that these ruptures are actually good for the ego and actually drive the ego development forward, which is why we should view them as a positive sort of instance. But let's get to that later. Now, the ego as the subjective core of the psyche has one precise role, and that is to build a coherent narrative, a coherent interpretive framework for the interpretation of material that we encounter. Now, this material that we encounter can be within ourselves or outside ourselves, as subjectively experienced again by the ego, or by the way we talk about, let's say, the psyche, right? Material that is outside ourselves would be something like you encounter a dog, or you encounter a plant somewhere, and you would encounter this plant, and you may say on a very simple level, oh, this plant is poisonous, or this plant smells really good. And this, we already see that this judgment depends on previous experience. So you're not able to objectively refer to a plant as smelling good. Now, this is difficult. That's also why I hesitated, because at some point objective judgment or judgment becomes quasi-objective. You can say, well, this plant smells good for almost everyone, almost all the time. But there are moments in your life and in everyone's life where this plant would smell bad. This is when you've had for example, when you've had a severe experience where you have smelled the plant and right after had, let's say, fallen ill, or you've had some kind of gut infection afterwards. This is a typical example. When you eat something, you have sort of a one-time exposure effect. You eat something and you have a gut infection, so you start puking and all that afterwards. You're very likely never to eat that again, because your body, with one single encounter or in one single instance, your body will associate this specific food or this specific smell with the danger of potentially dying, potentially being poisoned. Now, this only highlights, this may even occur in sort of elements or foods that are naturally considered really delicious or tasty, let's say ice cream, or pudding. So I know people that don't like, I had a client that didn't want to eat, she never wanted to eat pudding because she was always forced to eat pudding in kindergarten. Now, pudding typically is considered a very tasty food and sweet and everything. She couldn't eat it. Highlighting that, so the ego precisely responsible for this sort of framework that helps us interpret the world. Now, this doesn't mean that this person knew that putting, well, in this case she did, but you don't always have to know why you don't like something. And this already implies that the ego has unconscious components. Now, for Jung, properly speaking, the ego was not only conscious. Now, this is difficult to understand, but the ego is essentially that for Jung, which could theoretically be recalled. So which you can technically recall. This includes, obviously, elements that may be partly unconscious, in a certain moment, but can technically be recalled with some work. You already see that classical psychology or classical psychoanalysis, non-Jungian psychoanalysis, in a way continues working with the ego on the level of the ego, attempting to integrate certain personal unconscious elements in the ego. Now, for Jung, as we know, there is a deeper layer to, let's say, to the psyche, which is the collective unconscious. And this collective unconscious, as we'll get to see later, is sort of a layer that is unpersonal. It is the seat or the home, let's say, of the objective core of the psyche, or what Jung refers to as the self. But more than that, it is sort of the deeper layer of meaning, a deeper layer of meaning connecting physical reality and psychic reality across time and space. But again, we'll get to that later. Now, why is the ego a narrative? And why do we consider the ego a narrative? The ego essentially is the story, again, you tell about yourself, which is basically to say that you always try to narrate elements into a coherent framework. This is the sort of the core task of the ego, which simply means that, let's say, for instance, you have your knee starts hurting. Suddenly you wake up in the morning and you have you have a bruise on your knee and it hurts, and you're like, oh my God, where does this come from? You wouldn't attribute, rarely would you say, well, it simply happened. It happened, it doesn't matter. It just happened. You would always try to sort of explain, to attempt to sort of place this within the context of, let's say, last night's actions. You were out, you were drunk, and you hit you walked against a light pole or whatever, or I don't know, some kind of corner that you didn't take properly, and that's why your knee is bruised. And the idea here is that you try to sort of explain based on certain assumptions you have, you attempt to explain occurrences in the present. And this is key because it sort of tells us that the ego is built on fundamental assumptions that are projected into the future. And this tells us something very important about the ego. The ego attempts to build stability, sort of to build a stable framework that enables us, as we'll get to in the next chapter, to move through the world. But in the first instance, and I think this is we have to I always try to sort of nail this down, is to say you can't exist without these assumptions. There are fundamental assumptions that we'll get to in the next chapter of this video. There are very fundamental assumptions that we have about ourselves, about the world, that cannot be violated, that the ego immediately attempts to sort of protect itself from when they're violated. Now, the idea here is that the ego is really there to sort of build a coherence, to build a base, a campfire, if you will, from which you can explore that which is around you, that which we would consider to be unknown. Now, the ego thinks in its hubris, and this is an important point that Jung highlights that we can sort of get to in another video, the ego always considers itself to be everything, right? This is the natural hubris of the ego, right? The ego considers itself to know everything and to be everything, and on a very basic level, this, from children, adolescents. They if you have children and they're in adolescence age, they'll tell you as parents, and they'll say, no, Mom, I know this better, and I know, like, I want to date Peter, and I'm going to move in with Peter. I know how to live a life, and they have no clue. They have no clue. They don't know what life is. They've never worked. They have no idea. But they're convinced that they know everything. And this is the sort of the natural hubris of the ego. And we as adults have this as well. We think, oh, well, I always remember my dad who'd be like, oh no, I can lift this, and you're in the gym and you're like, well, no, I don't think you can. And I had the same when I was an adolescent, and he still hasn't, and he's a grown man, quite old in fact. And this highlights simply, I think, that the sort of the hubris of the ego never really vanishes. And although Jung proposes sort of these mechanisms, individuation, for instance, through which the ego sort of weakens these defense mechanisms, let's say, against sort of this unknown, against its own incapacity, the ego still continues to have this hubris over time. Now, individuation is a concept that we talk about in other videos a lot. It's essentially the attempt to break down these protective walls of the ego and integrate certain elements from the non-ego. Now, well, again, I have other videos on this. If you're interested, then go check out the channel. Now, in this brief intersection, please do subscribe to the channel if you like the content, and leave a like. It boosts the algorithm. I know it's annoying to say this, but it does boost the algorithm. And most importantly, leave a comment below, because it is very important for me to know what you like to see and what you think, and especially what you want me to talk about in future videos, because in the end, I do this to help people understand sort of and navigate the Jungian world and beyond, and this is why I need your feedback on what you want me to say, essentially. Now, let's get back to the topic. Essentially, the ego is there to navigate. Now, this is the next chapter here. The ego is the fundament that the sort of the torch that we go out into the world with, the light of consciousness that we carry into the darkness of the world. Now, what this means is that the ego is sort of, again, the map that we use to go through the world. And in this capacity as map, the ego is essentially sort of helps us orient. And what I mean by this concretely is it helps us interpret. It helps us understand and literally make sense of the sensory input that comes towards us. Now, this is extremely important for us, because we need to move through the world with this coherent, stable map. Because otherwise we would simply be overwhelmed by sort of, let's say, senseless input. That we wouldn't understand what everything that we encounter is about. There would be sort of shapes and you have to think about it. Sense input or sense perception is very strange, right? Sensory input is extremely weird. It's simply like the world doesn't really come before us, at least that's what neuroscience tells us, as that which it is. At least in the first instance, it comes before us as very fundamental details about certain capacities, let's say, or elements, edges, lines, certain lights and shadows cast. And the way we see the world is extremely dependent on the sense organs that we do have. And I don't know if people realize this, but a bee will see the world entirely different from us. It's the same world, but the bee has an entirely different image, if you will, of the world. And already there, on this very fundamental level, let's say like visual perception, we see that the world is fundamentally determined by the ego. Now, it goes a lot further than this, of course. Once you have consciousness involved, consciousness now sort of turns the world into, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that into an action loop based world, right? It's always the question that we ask ourselves when we encounter elements within the world is always, what does this do for me? And especially the question, what does this do for the assumptions that I have built into this structure that I refer to as me? Now, the structure that I refer to as me is the ego, right? So the question is always, what does this encountered element do for my ego, essentially? That's the fundamental question you ask yourself when you go out into the world and interact with it. Now, this means, let's say, for example, when you see a dog, you don't simply see a dog, you see the possibilities and threats within this dog, within this sort of thing that moves towards you. Now, I like dogs, but only certain dogs. I don't like strange dogs, like dogs that I don't know, and that look, let's say, not so fluffy. So for me, a dog that doesn't look fluffy and small is a potential threat, because and that's why my body will react in a certain way, indifferent of my control, right? And I would say, and Jung would agree with this, I think, that this is not part of sort of the, this is part of the narrative that I've built, i.e. part of the ego, right? Now, what is extremely important to realize here, and then we'll get to COVID-19 in the next chapter, or 2 chapters down the road. The ego is built upon sort of fundamental assumptions, and assumptions can be built in on a more fundamental level or a more shallow level. Let's say this the assumption that let's say a rose smells good is not so relevant to me because I never really smelled roses. I don't really have a connection to roses. No, this is not true. I like roses, but let's just assume this would be the case. So if someone now told me that a rose is poisonous, I also wouldn't really care. You know, it wouldn't really affect me. I'd be like, okay, well, so what? You know, but now, again, that was a very fundamental assumption. Let's say for me, it was extremely important that my partner is loyal to me, and I learned that she has been cheating on me for the course of our marriage. I would be, quite devastated, we would say, right? And how we would translate this to the ego is a fundamental assumption that I had about sort of the continuity of a certain element within the ego is shattered. Now, again, this presumes that you understand. So the ego is essentially built of these different elements. Now, these elements could be sort of the partner that I have that I project into the future to be loyal. And this element, again, is sort of thus endowed with a perception and a projection of it into the future. And now, the assumption that I have about the partner, of course, crystallizes. I say this in other videos. Now, if you're interested in these videos, go check them out. I have a lot of material on the ego. There's a whole playlist on the ego on the channel. Go find it. Now, basically this projection crystallizes this element in the external, so in the non-ego, that I obviously don't have control over. I don't have control over my partner. She can do whatever she wants, right? Like supposedly she's a free individual. Now, I would not agree with this statement. Like, I don't think we have a free will, but to a large extent. But essentially, she doesn't have to comply with the precise projections that I endow her with, and therefore she can simply go out and let's say copulate with others if she wants to. But for me, in my head, in my ego, I crystallize her. I say sort of I freeze her into this sort of one image that I have of her, and this one image is precisely this image of a faithful person. And because I do this, I become vulnerable, and this vulnerability is essentially based upon the fact that elements that are not under my control are assumed to be under my control, and this brings us back to these fundamental assumptions. I depend on these assumptions on the level of sort of the stability of the whole of the interpretive framework that I have about myself. Now, this is key, right? I depend on these assumptions because they are important. They are key for the whole of the structure of my ego. Now, it is key that my partner is loyal, because if she isn't, a lot of other assumptions break down. Let's say the assumption that I will have a stable family life throughout over the next 80 years, hopefully, whatever it is. I'd be a very old man then. That would be great. Perhaps not. But the assumption that my kids are going to grow up in a safe environment. The assumption that many assumptions. Those are the only two. Those are the only two. No, I'm just kidding. But many assumptions would break down, and this would lead to a sort of potential collapse of the whole ego, and that's what we refer to as ego death, right? The ego being breaking down in its entirety, having to be rebuilt, right? And we experience this obviously as trauma, right? And these would be what I would call ruptures of the assumptions, right? I refer to this as negative judgment, because sort of an element that I've indexed. We index elements within the sort of the continuity of the ego, right? You have this ego, and then you say, oh, I add an index here and an index there, and so this would be sort of positive judgments, I call them. That is, when I encounter my wife and she says, oh, I'll be faithful, then she indexes, she makes a positive judgment, indexes sort of upon this assumption of faithfulness. She makes a positive judgment. She says, I will be faithful. So there's an index of this faithfulness, which I then crystallize and project into the future, right? That is then the mechanism of the ego, this crystallization and this projection into the future to build a coherent narrative based on certain assumptions. Now, the encounter with reality, again, would be then considered a negative judgment, because this encounter with reality is precisely sort of acts upon the same element that I've at some point in the past crystallized as in the aftermath of this positive judgment of the other, right, and project into the future. Now, this negative judgment literally reverses the past. It acts upon the past. It changes my entire interpretation of the past. The past isn't fixed anymore. The floor under my feet is ripped away. I fall. I'm in free fall. The ego is dismembered, and I die, right? In a way, if you want to if you want to dramatize this a little bit. And this is precisely what happens. I find myself in a whirlwind, in a cement mixer. There's many studies on this. What happens when sort of people experience this rupture in the context of having cancer. For instance, as a disease, we project the body to be healthy, to be permanent and continuously healthy, because it is healthy today. It's been healthy in the past. Perhaps we have our maladies, but it's it's been mostly fine. And once sort of this reality hits, in a way, sort of everything breaks down. We find ourselves in a cement mixer. We're let's say entirely ripped apart, if you will. And this is precisely what happened in the instance of COVID-19 on the level of society, let's say. This was a long build-up, but the build-up sort of already told us everything that I'm going to tell you now about COVID-19, which is essentially the fact that society had built certain assumptions. Every individual carried these fundamental assumptions about themselves within the context of society. And society suddenly snapped them and broke them down, snapped them open and broke them down. Now, this snapping them open and breaking them down is basically ripping something open, to reveal the inside of it. And the inside is the truth of it, right? The inside is that which the ego hasn't built, the ego hasn't constructed. And I think this is maybe this is more of a philosophical point than it is a psychological point, but in a way I believe that, or I hypothesize here, I don't know if I believe it, but I hypothesize that COVID-19 ripped away certain assumptions that we had crystallized as members of society within our egos. We had crystallized those assumptions about ourselves and about society. And in this crystallization process, we've ignored so many other things. Precisely what we've ignored is the autonomy of that which we have crystallized, which is the autonomy of the sort of state apparatus. And the state apparatus, in its autonomy, has the power, we've endowed it with the power to control us as subjects. It's subjects, literally, right? And this precise endowment is, we've ignored that. We thought, oh, well, we participate in this concept that we call state apparatus or countries. And by this participation, we gain certain rights. And sure, we have some privilege, we have some duties, but we gain a lot of rights, and maybe we don't have a choice, maybe we have a choice, whatever it is. But we gain rights, and that's important, and everyone does it. So let's participate in it, and that's great. But what we've ignored is the fact that by precisely doing that, we submit ourselves to a certain amount of, let's say, control. And maybe this has been lurking in the back of people's head for a long time. It's like, oh, well, state has powers, and what happens, with police violence and everything. That's been a discourse for a while. But in this dramatic sort of exposure of the background, of the background of the background noise that had always been there, but had always been ignored too. It was dramatically exposed. There was a certain truth that was exposed, a certain insight that we had ignored over time. Now, this is precisely the same that sort of, there's a great quote, I don't know if it's a quote actually, but Jameson Webster, a psychoanalyst, said, the body reveals its truth in times of disease. And this is quite interesting, because we would think, no, when I'm at my best, I am who I truly am. And the notion here is precisely that, no, when you're at your best, your ego is at its strongest, in its strongest level, right? And this strongest level of the ego is precisely when we're at our most alienated from what we truly are, because the background noise is sort of that which is hidden beneath this layer of interpretation, beneath this layer of sort of the dutifulness, if you will. And the same applies to the level of society, right? It's like when the projections fall apart, and the negative judgment sort of kicks in, that's when we know what we are. That's when we have a chance to grasp sort of a moment of truth, if you will. And now, there obviously, I read this as a chance, so I see that, sorry, I have to write timestamps sometimes. I see this as a chance because we saw in COVID-19 a reality of society that was not specific to COVID-19. It's a reality that was revealed to us that is always there. Now, that doesn't mean that it's in any way a bad reality. It simply means that it is a reality. You know, there is the dog that I assume to be very friendly and that I pet all the time is a wild animal after all. And we have built a social construct around the dog as being a cute little animal that cuddles me in my bed. And I projected this into the future very well. And there's a heavy cocoon around this, the real animal nature of the dog. But the animal nature doesn't go away. Same goes for humans, right? The animal nature doesn't go away. And this was sort of when the walls of the ego break down, the shadow breaks forth. And I think this is quite, and precisely in the shadow, in these darkest moments, we find the truth that we are. And that's why I think it's a chance, right? I essentially read this as a chance for us as people living within a system to have this truth of the system revealed to us. Now, there's a similar image that Roland Barthes, a philosopher, put forth, which is that an image, a picture, a photograph, has two elements to it. There's the element of the studium, which is the interpretation of the photograph, sort of that which we, as society, as culture, interpret the photograph to be. And then there's the punctum, that which springs forth from the photograph itself, forcing upon us the reversal or the rupture of this interpretation. I think precisely that is what sprang forth in the moment of COVID-19, right? It was sort of the studium, that which we thought society was and we thought we were as a corpus of society, became broke down and revealed its insides. Now, thanks for watching to this point. If you enjoy this video, again, please do consider to give me a thumbs up. If you're interested in this kind of work, I am coming up with a book on this topic. Please consider to visit my website. You find the link in the description below. And again, please do comment what you think. Will be very much appreciated. Bye-bye.